Hello, welcome to Talking with Renata show. My name is Renata, I'm your host. And today we have a very special guest from very far away from the Eastern American coast, an American author and speaker in the areas of education, parenting, and human behavior. Welcome to Alfie Kohn. Hello.
Thank you. Hello.
I remember, on the TV talk shows, we ask guests about the first celebrity crush. And mine was you, at least in the parenting area. I was a young mom. It was hectic and messy at home. Kids were very young. They looked 1 and 2 years old. And, I realized that things I knew in life weren't doing anything or any good in my parenting journey. And things I wish I knew, I didn't know them, and I didn't know how to access them. And somehow I happened to find one of your books that was Unconditional Parenting book. And I remember reading it, and I didn't have any evidence at that time that any of what you were saying, was true or even science-based. But I just had this feeling. I felt at home. Like I felt this sounds right, like this sounds good. And so I read, you wrote what, like 13 or 14 books, like many of them. And I guess the most known of your books is Punished by Rewards, but the book I fell in love with was Unconditional Parenting, about unconditional love we give to our children. What's your favorite book, by the way, of all books you wrote?
Well, that's like asking a parent to pick what's her or his favorite child. I mean, I wouldn't have written them if I weren't committed to them. They're written in slightly different styles and about different topics. So I'm not sure that I could just pick out one that I'm most enamored of it. And when people ask me, what of your books should I read? I point them to my website where there's a description of all the books. I say, graze through this and see what, if anything, piques your interest, and then go for that one first.
Do you remember how it all started? Like, I still remember this feeling I had with your book, but do you remember how it all started for you? Like, what was the first glimpse of, something is missing, or we do things not the way we're supposed to do, with how we control our children's behavior?
Well, I think the kind of writing and speaking that I do is always prompted by a growing sense that good logic and values and evidence are pointing in this direction, and yet widespread practice is going in that direction. And that makes me angry. And whenever I feel that kind of anger, I know another book is coming. So it's that disparity between what makes sense to do and what most people are doing that animates my writing on a range of topics having to do with not only parenting, but especially schooling and other aspects of human behavior and human life.
You are a dad too. Have you discovered all those things because you were a dad, or your journey started like in this theoretical area of, discoveries?
Well, not theoretical. I mean, I am an ex-child after all. In fact, recent research shows that more than 87% of adults were children at some point or another. And I also was a teacher, and I have spent a lot of time with other people's children before I spent time with my own. But I also began to think about the application of broader ideas that I had written about to the question of parenting. And so in the other book you mentioned, Punished by Rewards, there were 2 chapters that dealt with parenting, where I sort of stuck my toe in the water tentatively because I was not yet a dad at that time. But I didn't want to presume to write a whole book on parenting until I had some experience of my own. But I was already predisposed to think about and new research that was relevant to the question of how we can work with people instead of doing things to them. And that includes with children as well. I would say my own experience as a parent just served to amplify and reinforce that commitment to giving kids more say and moving away from a model based on control.
You know how we say that both parenting and education experts, children are lucky because they live in perfect house with perfect parents, because we know it all, you know, we have all this knowledge. And so we are so lucky to live in those perfect houses. Is that true? Does that help? You know?
No, of course not. I mean, I assume you intend that ironically. You know, my children quickly figured out what I do for a living. And I tell you, you haven't lived until you say something to one of your kids, maybe when you're not at your best, only to hear them say something like, I wonder what Alfie Kohn would say about what you just said to me. You know, so we're all, as you say, on a journey. It's all about getting better. It's not as if I have gone to the mountaintop and received the wisdom and now I'm going to begrudge it to ordinary people. You know, we're all trying to figure it out. And one thing that parenting taught me is how you may have the right ideas, but you require a great deal of patience. Or as I like to say, when you're at the end of your rope, as a parent, your job is to somehow find more rope. And like all of us, you know, we succeed better at some times than others. But my own experience is probably of little interest to your viewers. So I'm much more interested in talking about the ideas themselves that I describe in the books.
So circling back to your book, my favorite of all times, not only from all the books you wrote, but in all the books I read about parenting, it still stays #1, unconditional parenting. What does unconditional mean?
It means that it's not enough for us to love our children or even to love them a lot. Rather, we have to love them without strings attached, without conditions. We have to love them for who they are, not for what they do. And it's more important even than our experiencing our love that way, because almost all parents, if asked, would say, of course, I love my child unconditionally. What matters is how they experience our words and our actions. And if they feel like our attention and approval and acknowledgement hinges on how they act, on their being polite and well-behaved, or being impressive at school or in sports, then we have a serious problem, because children then come to understand that our love for them and the extent to which they are lovable by implication depends on what they've done. And it is critical that they experience our love as undiminished, undimmed, even when they screw up or fall short. Maybe especially then, because that's when they most need to feel our love. I mean, care is not worthy of its name if it has to be earned, as if it were a transaction. And when I say all of that about the value, and there's good research to support this, of the unconditionality of parental care, most people will nod and say that makes sense. But the vast majority of parenting resources, articles, books, podcasts, and so on, are offering exactly the opposite of this. They're urging us to give kids a timeout, which is a euphemism for forcibly isolating children when they need us most, if they do something bad. Or on the flip side, to give them a verbal doggy biscuit, you know, good job, I like the way you ... And these are examples of conditional care, of saying you've done a job, and notice that workplace metaphor, that has to be good. It has to meet my standards, because praise is not support. It's certainly not unconditional love. It's the opposite of that. Praise is judgment. And the fact that it here happens to be a positive judgment rather than a negative one is incidental. What matters most is they feel judged, and they feel like they have to do something or not do something in order to get our care. And then certain forms of punishment are just the flip side of that. So before you nod and say, yes, love kids unconditionally, realize that if you're committed to that idea, it commits you to challenging the vast majority of advice we get for traditional parenting, which is conditional to its core.
Exactly. We are advised to channel or to change the behavior. And we all like emphasize, how do I change my children's behavior? How do I control it? How do I punish them or reward them in one or other way? And I remember one day when we got a dog, you know, it was a very small dog, and I called someone so she would help me to train her. And I remember she told me everything I had to do with this dog. It was like, wait a minute, that's everything I learned what not to do to my children. I'm not sure I'm capable to do that even to a dog now, because I know that it works. But I mean, you know, still, so often, I guess, parents, they are like, okay, so if I don't use punishment, because it works, I tested it, I know it works. And if I don't do rewards, so then what?
Well, let's back up a step. When we say it works, that's true in a certain limited way. I mean, if I'm standing there with a baseball bat and I threaten to hit you unless you sit down, you'll sit down if I'm bigger than you. Punishment, or the threat of punishment, can get one thing, and only one thing ever: temporary compliance at a huge cost. When we say to kids, do this, or here's how I'm going to make you suffer, the kid comes to ask the question, what do I have to do, and what do I get for doing it? Or in the case of rewards, or what am I supposed to not do, and what happens to me if I do it anyway? In both cases, it spoils the relationship between the adult and the child. If you're offering punishment, threatening punishment, the child is now about as happy to see you coming as you would be to see a police car in your rearview mirror. You're no longer a caring ally. If you offer to reward children with candy or special privileges or stickers or gold stars or money or praise, now you have become like a goodie dispenser on legs. And that's no closer to being a caring ally. This is the first thing to realize. Punishments and rewards are not opposites. They're not two different strategies. They're two sides of the same coin. They're both about doing things to children. And rewards, too, can work in the short run. If I promise to give you you're wearing a lovely scarf. If I promise to give you 100 euros to take off your scarf right now, would you do it? I think you would. See, rewards work. But they work to get only one thing, which is temporary compliance. And what the research finds is that both rewards and punishments are not only ineffective in the long run, they are actively counterproductive. They do harm. Children who are frequently punished, even if it's not the worst kind, which is physical punishment, where we do violence to a child, smacking or slapping, spanking or something, which teaches children to hurt others who are weaker than they are. And sometimes, sadly, they grow up and then hurt their own children, and the cycle of violence is perpetuated. But even if punishment is not physical, if we're taking away something they love or yelling at them or isolating them, nevertheless, what we find is that it makes the situation worse. So we have to use more and more punishment to make the bad thing go away, because we've made children more self-centered, more egocentric. Exactly the same thing is true with rewards. One of the most thoroughly replicated findings in the field of psychology is that the more you reward people for doing something, the more they tend to lose interest in whatever they had to do to get the reward. So research finds, for example, that when you reward or praise children for being generous, they become more self-centered and less likely to help others. Because what you've taught them is not helping is good. You've taught them the only reason to help is you'll get something out of it. Whether it's, a patronizing pat on the head or a sticker or something like that. Now you have made them less concerned about the impact of their actions on other people. Same thing is true when you punish kids for hitting or hurting or something like that. So let's be clear that rewards and punishments only can ever get temporary obedience, but they do a huge amount of damage to children's moral and social development, as well as to our relationship with them in exchange for that. So, having said that, it is easier for me to give a 5-minute summary of why doing to parenting, namely bribes and threats, inevitably fails. And by the way, I want to be clear, it's not a question of which punishment or what kind of reward or what schedule you do it on. These concepts are inherently counterproductive. There is no way to do a good reward or punishment because it is always about control. It is harder, although I attempt it in the second half of my book, to say in a few words what the alternative is. But we have to be clear to begin with what kind of alternative we're looking for. In other words, people say, how am I going to get my kid to do this if I can't use bribes and threats? I want to step back and ask about the goal. Because a lot of times when kids don't do what we tell them, the problem is not with the kid, it's with what we've told them. Very few parenting resources will ask you to question that. Most parenting books begin by assuming that whatever the parent has demanded of the child, that's automatically legitimate. Now here are some tricks for getting compliance. And I think, I'll just give you a quick example. My child's room is a mess, so I'm not supposed to punish her for having the room a mess. I'm not supposed to reward her for cleaning up. How am I supposed to make the kid clean up? And I'm not going to give you another technique. Instead, I'm going to ask, why should this child's room, the only place on the planet that belongs to her, have to be kept up to your standards? The problem is with what you've asked. Now, there are other cases where the request might be reasonable, and then we can start thinking about what does it mean to support kids, to work with them. Very briefly, what I talk about in the book is, first of all, inviting parents to try to imagine how the world looks from the child's point of view, which psychologists call perspective taking. Parents who do that regularly tend to be better parents in many respects. Second, to do a lot less telling and a lot more asking, and meaningful asking, where we don't know what the child is going to say in response. And to give kids more say about solving problems, to bring them in on this. I like to say that children learn to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And so the more we encourage them to participate in solving a problem in whatever way is developmentally appropriate, you're not going to ask a 3-year-old in the same way you ask a 13-year-old, is likely to help a child become a more ethical person, a more responsible person. So, of course, there's much, much more about working with in the book, but all I can offer are general guidelines and principles for parents who are listening to adapt. What I cannot do is give a specific response to, like, what I get by email all the time, people writing to me at my website, here's what my child is doing, what should I do? And I have to apologetically say, I don't know you or your child. It would be presumptuous for me to suggest an answer. But one more thing, I know I've been talking for a long time, but let me just make an important distinction here. You talked before about trying to control kids' behavior and how that's not such a good idea. Obviously, I agree with you. But the first problem with that is not just the control, it's focusing on behavior. The more times you see the word behavior in a book for parents, the worse that book probably is. Because when you're focusing on only the action that you can see and measure, you are invariably going to use bribes and threats to try to change that behavior. It follows logically. But what matters is not just the behavior the child engages in, but the child's reasons and motives and values that underlie and inform that behavior. What matters is the child. When you focus on behavior, you're missing the child who engages in the behavior. And so a working with approach begins by looking underneath the action. What's generating it? What might be leading to it? And then we bring the child in on seeing it as not an infraction to be punished, but a problem to be solved together.
While I was listening to you, I was thinking about, so first it sounds like more work, because it's so much easier to just give a candy or promise, I don't know, more screen time.
Of course. Yes, being a real parent is much more labor intensive than treating your child like a pet, which is basically what traditional parenting is like, with rewards and punishments.
And also, I guess my next real question is, where do we get the motivation to do this extra work? Because we have to, it's a very intense feeling to tolerate this, I would say, groundlessness. When you control your child, you have a sense of control, and it feels safe, and you feel safe, and you have this feeling that you're in control.
Yeah, for 20 seconds.
Yes, but still, it feels good.
It feels good until it boomerangs on you, and you realize that you cannot make a child go to sleep. You cannot make a child stop crying. You cannot make a child respect you, which is why a lot of parents settle for making them fear them. So in a way, yes, it's more time consuming to do this, but in a way, it's also more efficient in the long run, because this old approach doesn't work. So you have to keep offering more and more rewards or more and more punishments to try to get that reaction. And at some point, you realize that it's not working. The trick is to realize that it's not because you used the wrong punishment or the wrong kind of reward, it's because you were doing rewards and punishments at all. But when you do what I talk about, which is creating an unconditional caring relationship and bringing kids in on solving problems and taking their needs seriously, in a way, parenting becomes much more gratifying for you too, as well as for them. And in some ways, it heads off potential problems. So it's like, you get that quick hit of, yes, I'm in charge. I put down my foot. I show the kid who's boss. But it's illusory, and it's ephemeral. It doesn't last. And in the long run, the kids you see who are constant headaches, constantly causing trouble, are more likely to come from those traditional households where the parent thought that they were just going to feel like they're in charge and do something quick and dirty that works. Get to your room right now. But in the long run, it makes things less pleasant and may take more time. So that's one answer to the question of how you find the motivation to do it, because what I'm suggesting isn't just nicer, it works better. And the more ambitious your long-term goals for your kids, the greater the difference in the effectiveness. In other words, if you want your child not just to be a nice kid who's well-behaved, but you want your child to be a morally sophisticated person who takes responsibility, who is genuinely happy, and ethical, then this is the only way to do it. The traditional way is going to make it less likely that children will grow up that way. Which is why when I give a parenting talk, I usually begin by asking, what are your long-term goals for your child? What would you like your child to be like years from now? And I get the same answers everywhere I go. And then what I do for a living is say, you say you want this, so why are you doing that? You say you want your child to be a caring, generous person? well, then you've got to stop doing punishments and rewards, because here's the research showing that makes them less generous. The same thing is true with responsibility, with happiness, with unconditional self-esteem, and so on. Plus, if you don't buy any of that, sort of the empirical argument that this is actually more effective, then I'll come down to my bare bones value judgment, which is that it is just more appropriate ethically to treat a human being of any age this way than to manipulate them to do what you want.
And I remember someone saying that, you know, I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who has lost. Because when we are in control, meaning someone isn't, when we like try to, you know, undergo someone's decision because I said so, meaning
Right.
someone had to somehow live with it. Like someone told me to do things and I had to do them. I didn't have choice. And it feels terrible inside. And you somehow have to, you know, give it back. So you might.
Oh, that's right. What psychology teaches us about individuals, what history teaches us about nations, that those who have been feel like victims will turn into victimizers if they get the chance.
And the goal you mentioned, like, what are your goals for your kids? I think this is the good starting like point, because if I want to have, like, if I want my child to be able to think by himself, this is not the same as being compliant.
Right.
And I need to see how what I do in my actions on a daily basis, do I emphasize being independent and a thinker by himself, or do I emphasize and put more control into just comply and do as you were told?
Right, that's right. So we have to decide if we're serious about long-term goals, because I don't think all parents really do want their children to be independent thinkers. And not all teachers want their students to be that either. And a lot of school systems are based on the premise that we want them to grow up to do what they're told, you know. And so we end up with democracy being a very shaky concept in most of the world, if it's present at all. The way we raise and teach kids is perfect for helping them to adapt to the real world if they live in a totalitarian society. Because I said so is a chilling totalitarian statement, and it doesn't become any more acceptable because an adult says it to a kid.
Exactly. Thank you for your time and for that discussion. I'm also grateful to the technology that allows to people to talk from across the world and to have this discussion. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Me too. And if anybody is interested in more on this, I have a website for those who read English, which is just my name, alfiekohn.org, which has not only information about my books, but also a lot of free articles for parents and teachers.
I'm going to put all of that in the notes, like the link to your website and your books, and like alfiekohn.com, yeah?
.org, yes.
.org. Okay, I'm going to do it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your interest. Bye-bye.
Bye.